Hi there, and I hope you're having a great Wednesday so far. Welcome to today's webinar, Unlocking the Full Power of MAP Growth Data. My name is Kendall Hunter, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. I'm the product marketing manager for Otus, but I'm also a former middle school special education teacher and reading specialist, so happy to be here having this conversation. If I had to estimate, I've probably collectively spent over 100 hours analyzing MAP growth data myself as a teacher. So this topic is something that I know I'm passionate about. My presenter today, Mary, is very passionate about, and we're just here to make data as fun and relevant as we can for this next hour. As I mentioned, I am with Otus, and we are excited to be sponsoring today's webinar to showcase one of our partners, NWEA. We'll be talking all about using MAP growth data to understand your students. If you're new to Otus, we are a K-12 student data and assessment solution that really brings all your student data into one place. We provide educators and administrators with not just the insights they need to understand their students, classes, the school, or even district performance across measures, but the tools to intervene early and often, really ensuring growth at every level. I've just got a couple housekeeping items for you all, and then I'm going to introduce Mary, our MAP growth expert. Let's just talk about the technical aspects of today so you can get all the content we have for you. Please be sure to check the audio settings on your computer as well as your speaker volume settings if you're having any trouble hearing me. If you're having other issues or that persists, there is a detailed audio troubleshooting file in the resource list that's under your Q&A window. If the console freezes at any point or hear music, just go ahead and refresh your browser and we will pop back right up on your screen. There are some other features within this webinar platform I want to mention. Mary and I have put together an incredible resource list so you can download content on both NWEA, MAP Growth, and Otus. So be sure to check out that resource list to download perhaps the slides, but some of the other resources that we'll call out throughout the presentation for you all today. You can contribute to our conversation on Twitter. We certainly encourage you to do so. Use the hashtag EW or EdWeek webinar, and don't forget to tag at Otus K-12. As we jump into our discussion, we do welcome your questions. There is a Q&A box accessible through the tabs on your console. Be sure to put them there and not the group chat. That'll just help me navigate things as we get going here. And I will say we have dedicated Q&A time with Mary at the end of the webinar here. So we appreciate you teeing up some questions for us. Finally, this will be recorded. I know that's everyone's favorite question. Yes, this is recorded, and you can access an on-demand archive of today's presentation within the next 24 hours. You'll also get that by email, so don't worry about that. If you need to step away or we're just fortunate to have you here for part of the presentation, you can always circle back and revisit content or rewatch whatever you need. So for today, I want to go ahead and introduce Mary Razanovich. Mary is a content design and development lead who has been with NWEA since 2011, so a very long time, working on both item development and test design. Mary's current focus is really helping educators to use MAP growth data to make instructional decisions through curriculum partnerships and really ensure the appropriate use of assessment data to support teachers and students. She's going to talk a lot about that today as far as what we can do with the data that we have. In addition to working at NWEA, Mary has 10 years of experience in educational publishing and was both an elementary education teacher and K-5 gifted and talented specialist. You're with two former educators here who are happy to be leading the content. As far as goals for today and what you're going to get during this next hour, I just want to set the table on what we'll be talking about, and then I'll hand it off to Mary. But by the end of this session, you will have a better understanding of, first, what MAP growth scores tell us. Second, how the data can be used. Third, where formative assessments fit in, and then some ideas of interventions that you can really add to your toolkit. All of this is about adding tools to your kit so you can do more to support students. At the end, I will show you how you can track interventions over time to really see what's working and what's not working, so you can kind of recalibrate and go from there. So we are excited to really get into the essential questions for today and the meat of our presentation. Mary, hello and welcome. Thank you for being here with me. I just want to kind of started off here by setting the table to talk about what information you can get from MAP growth data. So I'm really going to hand it off to you to talk more about what MAP growth tells us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kendall. I just want to start by thanking you and Otus for sponsoring this webinar and for inviting NWEA to participate. I think we have a lot of interesting information between the two organizations to share with teachers. So let's jump in. Before we address the first question in terms of what kind of information you can get from MAP growth data, I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of their understanding of MAP growth. I'm assuming most folks here have used it, but we may be at differing levels of understanding. So MAP growth is a norm-referenced interim assessment which measures both student achievement and growth over time. It's an adaptive test, so students are going to see items from on and off grade, and the idea is it's going to kind of target the student's zone of proximal development. The RIT score that a student gets actually represents where they're getting about 50% of the content correct, which is something that can be confusing for some folks because they're trying to identify that sweet spot where they're kind of ready to kind of further their learning. So just using that to kind of set the table for everybody. So now let's kind of get back to that question of sort of what does that mean in the context of the MAP growth data that's provided. So I want to kind of give an overview of the types of data that teachers and administrators can get and the types of insight that MAP growth data can provide. So at a high level, MAP growth data gives you a general understanding of a student's ability in kind of the high level domains of math, reading, language usage, and science. Those are the four main content areas that we assess. As a curriculum agnostic universal screener, it can be used for RTI screening to flag students who are potentially at risk. We've actually published a study which provides districts and administrators guidance about using MAP growth as a universal screener. That's one of the resources that we've linked to the webinar. MAP growth data can be used as one of multiple measures to determine students who might need extra support. Maybe they don't need intensive intervention, but they might need that little bit of extra support or scaffolding, or who might be ready for enrichment or a little bit more challenge. Our research team is constantly doing linking studies to connect RIT and MAP growth data to both state summative tests, the SAT and the ACT, so we can link our RIT scores to proficiency levels for each of these assessments. So although MAP growth itself isn't a benchmark test, these linking studies give teachers a sense of how each student is performing relative to those state summative and college and career ready benchmarks. We also have linking to college and career readiness in a slightly different way. And this is a tool that again, not as many folks might be aware of. We have something called a College Explorer tool. In the same way that we've linked RIT to state summative benchmarks and to those ACT and SAT tests, we've also linked RIT scores to national benchmarks for colleges and universities, sometimes actually down to the major level. So if a student, in high school is exploring different opportunities in terms of what they might want to study, what schools they're interested in, you can help them, you can use this tool to set goals for them in terms of achieving those different college aspirations. That's something we're also linking to in this, the resources. Another way that teachers and administrators can use MAP growth data is in evaluation. So you can evaluate the impact of new curricular tools, new teaching approaches, different interventions they might be trying. We're going to dig into this idea a little bit more later. And then finally, MAP growth data can be used to inform instruction at a high level. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes and then sort of how that dovetails into some of the offerings that Otus has. So when we talk about what you can do with MAP growth data and the type of data that it provides, I find it's kind of useful to think about it at different levels. So I want to start at sort of the highest level with school and district questions. So these are things that school administrators, principals, superintendents might kind of look at their MAP data to find answers to these questions. So at this level, MAP growth is great for sort of showing trends across a school or across the whole district. these trends can help determine, again, if a new program or a new approach to teaching is positively impacting students, or if you might want to reevaluate it. Administrators can also examine data across grades or schools to kind of look to see, is there a school or a grade that's really excelling, or a grade that's showing like that they're needing some more support. And this can be a really powerful tool to really uncover what's driving high growth in any of your particular schools, or again, at a grade level. NWEA actually did some research in this area. Back in 2018, a group of our researchers examined longitudinal data on achievement and growth for about 700,000 students in about just under 25,000 public schools. From there, the researchers zoomed in at about 800 schools that were producing high growth year after year for students across achievement levels. So we weren't looking at schools where, every student was high performing all the time. We were looking at schools where students were all over the map, from high to low performing, but they were showing consistent high growth. And eventually we wound up doing a really deep collaboration with 2 schools in Schiller Park, Illinois, to identify, what was working there. What were the specific strategies that were helping to produce this consistent high growth for all students? We actually got a whole set of research and a white paper about sort of 10 transformative strategies that really helped within this school. An administrator or principal superintendent could do the same type of research on a smaller scale, dig into where are we seeing consistent high growth, again, at a school level, at a grade level, what's happening there, what are some things that we could leverage and then bring throughout the whole district. So this is a really powerful piece of the MAP growth data. It takes a little bit more work and a little bit more digging, but you can really kind of amplify effective strategies across the district. District-wide data can also help ensure that you're seeing growth across students from all socioeconomic and racial backgrounds. So you want to check to make sure that whatever program you're running is having an equitable impact for all learners. And of course, it lets administrators know whether or not students are demonstrating readiness for any high-stakes summative assessments. Now at the class level, we're kind of getting down to the teacher level here, and the teacher sort of has 2 levels. They can look at their class as a whole and then obviously drill down into their students. So if we're taking a look at sort of the larger class level, one of the things that MAP growth is really helpful with is just getting a sense of how academically diverse your class is, right? So if you look at your class profile report, you'll see these achievement percentiles, and it's got the whole class divided into these quintiles, or sort of 20 achievement bands that are organized by 20 percentage points. You can also see how the class as a whole's achievement, their average RIT and their median percentile, compares to national peers. So this can give you a sense of how the academic diversity of the class is sort of skewing relative to those national norms. You can zoom down a little bit more and look at the instructional area quintiles. So this will give you a little bit more of a sense of the relative areas of strength and opportunity, again, at a class level. But this can be powerful when you pair it with sort of your scope and sequence and kind of take a look at, which areas you might need to account for some more time if you've got a bulk of the class that's performing a little bit lower, or areas where you might be able to make up a little bit of time because you've got more students kind of on a higher end of the achievement scale within that instructional area. You can start getting down to that student level, not so much looking at the individual students, but just kind of, you can sort by overall RIT and kind of get a general sense of, kind of how the students are playing out within the class, maybe get some rough idea of some potential groupings to explore within the class. And then finally, you can look at the test details by student. You can go to the achievement status and growth summary report to see how many students made or exceeded their projected growth. And that's actually something, right now it's on a separate report, but next year it'll be moving on to that same class profile report. All right, so now let's drill down to the student questions. Again, I've looked at my class as a whole, and I'm going to start digging into individual students to get a sense of how they're doing within the class. We can obviously compare students' growth and achievement to nationally representative norms to get a sense of how they compare to their grade level peers. And just a note, so that our norms, we do sculpt them to be nationally representative. When you are looking at a student's percentile norm, what it's telling you is how they compare to other students in the same grade, as well as students who've had the same number of instructional weeks. So we know some schools test kind of right as they get into school at the beginning of the year, and some test a little bit later in the fall. So those norms are actually adapted to that, so that you're getting very, very precise information about that. Again, instructional area scores can help you identify areas of strength, which can be leveraged to help kind of improve the areas of opportunity for each student. One thing we always ask teachers to kind of think about or question when they look at a new score report, we always want you to check to make sure, is this consistent with past scores, any classroom data you might have. We always emphasize that map growth is a single point in time, right? That data represents one point in time. So you want to confirm that what you're seeing is aligned to past data. And if you have any data about your students, it's aligned to what you know about them. So if we're talking about fall data, obviously you may have less time to get to know your students, but you can take a look at that trend line in achievement over time, keeping in mind we often see either a plateau or a small dip after the summer. But if you're seeing a real big change in either direction, that's something you might want to investigate more. And that leads to some other questions to explore. If you're seeing, greater than expected growth, what could that be attributed to? Did the student participate in a summer course? Did the student, if we're talking about fall scores, if I'm, again, putting some interventions between fall and winter, what did I do? Maybe that increase was due to some of the things that we tried. Likewise, if you're seeing something that seems out of line because it's lower than what you would expect, you'd want to just make sure there wasn't some underlying cause, even to see, was the student sick when they took their test? Was there some kind of issue at home? So you would just want to tease out and see if there is some reason where the student's results might not reflect their true achievement. And then obviously you'd want to use that data with some real care and intention. And then finally, again, at the teacher level, you can see how a student is predicted to perform on state summative tests. But here also, you can drill down to get a sense of, okay, if my student is not predicted to meet those state summative benchmarks, how much growth do they need to make? What's a realistic amount of growth? So you can get down a little bit more granular than you might do at that administrative level. And that's a good time to kind of shift to talking about the idea of growth. So very often in education, we kind of sort of tend to orient more around the idea of achievement. So you look at these two students and you think, oh, the one on the right had a better year because she's got a higher RIT score relative to the student on the left. But if we layer in growth, it shifts that perspective a bit. It kind of changes the discussion. So if we look at this now and we see how much growth the student on the left made, we say, well, they had a better year. Maybe they haven't achieved that same achievement level, but they've made much more significant growth than the student on the right. And I remember this when I was teaching. I would get a student who might be 2 or 3 years below grade level. They come into my class in the fall. I had a couple students who were really very early in their journey of learning English. And I knew I probably wasn't going to be able to get them to grade level in a year, but I could make really good progress. But, you come to the end of the year and the state summative test tells you what you know. Student's not proficient. Well, I know that, but I had no way of showing, nope, they're not proficient yet, but they've made amazing growth. And they've made maybe above typical growth. And that's the sort of thing that map growth can really capture and also help you move that student towards that goal of proficiency with a little bit more ease. One of the ways that we encourage people to look at this idea of growth and achievement, and sort of one of our most popular reports, is this quadrant chart. And so you can look at growth and achievement within this on different axes. So growth is on the x-axis and achievement is on the y-axis. And the default mode sets both to 50th percentile, but you can actually update these and customize them to match if you have district targets for achievement or for growth. You can look up what your state summative cut scores are for your grade, or if you're dealing with students in middle or high school, what the ACT or college SAT linking studies show. So you can adjust this. And this can help a teacher start to think about their class, not at the class level, not at that student level, but kind of somewhere in between in terms of the grouping. So if I dig into it, I'm going to start taking a look at my students who they're low achieving, but they've shown high growth. So there's an area I want to dig into. What's helped these students, to achieve that high growth? Is there anything there that I could maybe take over and use with my students who are low achieving but not growing in that same way? So I can sort of look at these groups of students. You can drill in to see, the specific students themselves. So I'm thinking about actual students, but then sort of trying to apply to the group as well. Also highlights things like students who are high achieving but low growth. These are the students that sometimes they kind of fall through the cracks if we're not paying attention, because they're on track, hopefully, or they probably going to make proficiency, but they may not be, having all their needs met or having their potential really stretched. So this is, as I said, is just sort of a nice way of thinking about, how your class kind of falls into these 4 quadrants. The other really interesting tool that you can use in terms of student growth is this Growth Goal Explorer. So this is a tool that we developed to kind of help visualize student growth compared to state expectations. And again, it can then support developing meaningful and realistic academic goals. And you can, if you're having trouble seeing this as I'm sharing my screen, you can adjust the size of this in your window so you can zoom in a little bit more. But I'm going to show you how to use it. It's pretty straightforward. So you go down to here and you can input student's grade. I'm going to keep this at 5th grade. I'm going to make my student, you put in the state. I'm going to make them from Nevada. It's going to update. Oh, nope, sometimes it does that. I think I didn't refresh it. You can put in their fall RIT score, and then you have to tell what subject that is for. And I'm going to select reading for this one. And it gives you a little bit of information about where the student is now. It kind of grounds you in, okay, they got a 200, tells you the RIT scale is 100 to 350, and then where that puts the student. So they're in the 39th percentile for achievement. So again, relative to those national norms. And then you get down to here and it gives you some information about setting spring growth goals. So it talks about average growth. This is what you're going to see when you look at growth reports in MAP Growth. We always orient around typical growth, which is 50th percentile growth. This is how much other students, again, same grade, same number of instructional weeks, this is how much they tend to grow. It also allows you to look at an aspirational growth goal. So if you want to push that student a little bit more, this is a goal that about 40% of similar students make. You can also set a custom growth goal. And what's really nice, if you scroll down to this graph down here, it kind of gives you a sense of, well, here's my fall score, and here's these 3 different trajectories. My typical growth, 50th percentile, that aspirational growth, or the 40th percentile, then I can set a custom goal. And I see here, this is overlaid with my state proficiency benchmark. So Nevada is for proficiency in reading in the spring, a student needs to be at a 214. College Ready is just above that at 215. I'm going to set my state proficiency as my custom growth goal, just to get a sense of how realistic that may or may not be. Oops, it's booting me out. Let's see. Well, for some reason, try it one more time. Sometimes it takes a moment. There we go. So now it's readjusted this to show, okay, if I want to get this student up to proficiency, it gives me some data about that. Again, it's telling me average growth is about what 50% of students make. Aspirational is about 40%. When I look at this custom goal that I've set, it's showing me that only about 17% of similar students are able to make this type of growth in a year. So that gives me some sense of this may not be your realistic goal to get this student to proficiency within this year. So I may need to start talking about a multi-year plan Or each year, I'm going to push that student beyond typical growth, but I'm going to still be setting realistic goals to try and get them to that proficiency. So this tool is pretty simple to use and provides a great deal of context when you're talking about goal setting with students and where they are versus the proficiency you're trying to get them towards.
Mary, that was one of the tools that you showed me that I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I had this. This is so useful. So thank you for showing that and popping open the actual screen for it. As a reminder to our attendees, that is in the resource list. So you can go right to that website to access that same tool that Mary was on, bring that back to your team. I know I always like being in webinars and leaving with like a list of things I can bring back to make everyone's life easier. So be sure to do that on your end. I also just want to call out those questions you provided by student, class, and district are just so powerful. I know if I was in a PLC with my team, I would be bringing those with and using that to really calibrate the conversation around students maybe not being there yet, but acknowledging where growth is being made. So that reframing that you mentioned and the questions to kind of get us there are just so important to have as tools to be able to really unpack this data. Of course, with any data, first we have to understand it before we can ever really figure out what we're going to do with it. But I want to transition into kind of using that data now. Mary, can you talk a little bit more about how educators and administrators can really use MAP growth data to inform instruction?
Yeah, absolutely. This is obviously a question we get quite a bit. And as with before, I kind of want to start at a high level and again, just ground everybody on what MAP growth is and what it isn't. So a really good way to think about MAP growth is as a highly accurate thermometer, which may sound strange, but a thermometer is really good at letting you know who has a fever, right? Do you have a fever or do you not? But it can't tell you why you might have a fever. It can't diagnose at all. So just always want to emphasize that MAP growth is not a mastery measure or diagnostic measure. It's not its intent or its purpose. MAP growth tests have a maximum of 43 questions, 3 of which are field test questions. So they're designed to precisely and efficiently measure a student's growth and achievement, again, in the area of math or reading or science at that very high level. And again, to show that growth over time. But with 40 active test questions, not counting the field test ones, we can't get down to report on standards or skill mastery. So although we have our learning continuum, which shows kind of the map of the test, here are the sort of, here's where the standards are covered and how they play out in terms of RIT scores, we can't drill down to say your students mastered this or they're great on this standard. It's just too high level of a test to do that. And it's not its purpose. The other thing I just always want to give as a caveat, we always talk about MAP growth being one source of data. If you're making any type of high stakes educational decision, you always want to pull in, classroom data, formative assessment data, anything else like that before making any type of really impactful decision about a student's program. So that out of the way, what can you do with MAP growth? How can it help you with instruction? And it can. We're going to talk through some of these at greater depth, but I just want to talk about some of the ways that you can use MAP growth with instructional decision making. We've talked about the RIT score. You get overall RIT and instructional area RIT. Students are also given a Lexile and quantile measure along with their RIT scores. We've conducted linking studies between these measures to report those out. And knowing, we'll drill into Lexile because I think most people are use that more often or more familiar with it. If you know a student's Lexiles, that helps you plan how much support you're going to need to help them access on-grade text. So we always emphasize we don't want you using the Lexile from MAP growth to kind of keep students in that text. You should still be teaching them at that on-grade level. But if there's a big gap between their Lexile, their independent reading, and their the text that you're teaching, the Lexile level of the on-grade text, you know that you're going to need to, provide more supports and more scaffolding. You can use that Lexile range to get some independent text sets to help build background knowledge that'll help them access that on-grade text. And quantile, while not as commonly used, it can be used in a similar way. So if you do use the quantile frameworks, from Metametrics, they have quantile associated with different math, skills and topics. So you could take a look at what's coming up for your upcoming unit. Say I'm going to teach something on area of a rectangle. I'm going to take a look at my quantile framework to see kind of how they're ranking that in terms of its quantile score. Where's my student's quantile score? Okay, if there's a big difference, I'm probably going to need to give that student some additional support. So neither of these should be used to keep students out of on-grade content, but just to kind of give you a sense of how big is the leap potentially to help them get to that on-grade content. Again, we've talked about instructional areas a lot. They can help you get sort of one level below that high domain level to give you a sense of a student's or a class's areas of strengths. This comes really powerful kind of at a term level or at even the year-long planning level. I say term because you'll get new data, you know, in the winter potentially to be able to update it. But if I pair up the instructional areas with my different content units and kind of identify which instructional areas pair to specific units, I can get a sense of where I might need to slow down a little bit in my pacing because I've got a lot of students who are going to need more support, or where I might be able to make up a little bit of ground because students generally are a little bit higher in that area. Once, you know, I've used that to identify students who are maybe performing in a particular area. Again, I'm going to be working on this unit on, you know, finding area of a rectangle. I'm a math person, so I apologize. I always default to those examples. But, you know, if I see some students who are a little bit lower in measurement and data, I might then bring out some formative assessment to gather some information about those students. What are the areas where they might be struggling a little bit? If there anything I need to reinforce or shore up on before I get to that unit? Taking that formative data, taking my map growth data, I also then might want to form some flexible learning groups. Again, we want these to be sort of short term. I don't want kids to be in the same group for the entire term till the next score comes through. But based on my formative data, I'm going to make these groups that I've got a particular goal I want to move them along with, and then I'm going to, you know, keep doing that formative data to kind of assess whether they need to be in those groups or I need to shift them around at all. We've talked about how schools can use the data to assess effectiveness of program or instructional changes, and teachers can do this too on a smaller scale. Again, that quadrant chart that we looked at is a really great way of doing that, kind of looking at chunks of you know, the 4 quadrants of students to see what did I implement with these students that may have helped them move up in terms of growth, or maybe didn't. What do I want to reassess? So that's a great thing that teachers can do as well, really digging into sort of the nitty-gritty of the you know, scaffold structures, supports that they did in between those map growth administrations. And then finally, we talked about this idea of gauging the academic diversity of your class, because we know that's really going to affect your instructional planning. So I want to dig into this a little bit more to kind of play out what this might look like for a teacher. So if I take a look at, again, going back to my class profile, I'm going to take a look and see, you know, what my class mean RIT is and the median percentile. And if the class mean RIT is much higher or much lower than the median, that gives me a sense of kind of whether I have more students at the higher or lower end of the class range. But I can also drill down again to this the chart here where I take a look at the quantiles to get a sense of, or quintiles rather, to get a sense of where students, you know, how much of a spread is it? Do I have just a couple of kids at the top or lower quintiles? Is everybody kind of packed in the middle? Do I have an even spread across the class? That's going to have a huge impact on, you know, how I'm thinking about my whole class instruction. So again, looking at that distribution, how are students clustered around that 50th percentile? Or again, I might want to think in terms of whatever the proficiency level is that I'm aiming toward with that predicted proficiency. And then thinking about, okay, how is this going to affect my whole class instruction? You can then take it another level down to look at these instructional areas. Again, seeing where they performed as a whole class for their relative areas of strength and sort of relative areas of opportunity. And I made a new set of data to look at because the data we have in our sample reports is a little funky. So taking a look at this, we kind of zeroed in on this. This would be a class that took a 2-5 math test. And I've got the quintiles for their instructional area performance. And I can see that about 60% of them are performing in those lowest 2 quintiles, that red and orange bars. So that means about 60% of my class is performing about 40%, I'm sorry, below the 60th percentile, below the 40th percentile. Sorry, let me restart that. So I've got students, about 60% of my students are performing below the 40th percentile. Sorry about that. Got all my percentiles and quintiles mixed up there. So I know when I hit anything related to operations and algebraic thinking, any of the topics, again, I can go to my learning continuum, see what my standards are assessed in that instructional area. I know I'm probably going to need more time. I'm going to need to have more formative assessment kind of set and ready to go. I'm going to need more whole class supports and scaffolding ready for that. And again, I'm going to do some more formative assessment to probe more in there, but just at a high level. I know that that's an area of opportunity for me to kind of really move my kids up. On the flip side, if I look at measurement and data, I kind of have the opposite. I've got about 60% of my class that are falling, they're above the 60th percentile. So they're doing pretty well in this area. So I'm sure going to still have some students at that lower end, still going to need to have support and scaffolding ready, but I can probably move a little faster with the whole class for these topics. And when I look at the other 2 instructional areas, I got a pretty wide spread, got a lot of kids at the top and a lot of kids at the bottom. So I know when I get to these areas, geometry, number and operations, I'm going to need to have my whole toolkit ready to go. I'm going to need to have scaffolds, enrichment, going to have a lot of robust things in my toolkit for this. So let's try and take this and kind of apply it to a real scenario. So I'm going to imagine that I'm a 4th grade teacher. I'm getting ready to teach an upcoming unit on multiplicative comparison. And again, I see from my class profile as a whole, area of opportunities, operations and algebraic thinking. So the unit that's related to this content, I've got about 60% of my students who are in those lower 2 quintiles. And I've got measurement and data as an area of strength, kind of with that reverse profile. I've got about 60% of the class, above the 60th percentile. So I want to think about how can I leverage some of that strength in measurement and data to be able to support some of those struggling areas in operations and algebraic thinking. So, when I teach this, I might leverage that strength and use tape diagrams and relate it to scaled bar graphs or bar graphs, just to kind of make that connection for students to something that they have a little bit more of a strength in. I'm obviously going to conduct some formative assessments to uncover a little bit more about strengths and areas of opportunity. So I might dig in to see just how they do with word problems in general. Is it a language issue? Is it an understanding or interpretation of the word problem? I might do a little probing to see how they are in terms of solving equal groups multiplication word problems, because if they don't have that foundation, I'm not going to be able to distinguish the difference between that and multiplicative comparison. And again, I'm going to take that data from the formative assessment, I'm going to take the student details and the class profile, and I'm going to start to form some short-term groups. And I may form different types. So I'm probably going to form homogeneous groups for some targeted support. I know this group of kids maybe didn't really understand equal groups multiplication, so I'm going to work with them on that. But I'm also going to form some heterogeneous groups to practice problem solving in general. So I want those mixed groups as well. And again, continuous formative assessment to monitor and make changes in those groups. And that's really critical. And this is a good place to pass it back to Kendall, because formative assessment is so critical to making that connection between map growth data and the classroom.
Yes, thank you so much. And before I jump into anything here, I just want to thank everyone for the incredible engagement. There are so many good questions coming in. Don't worry, I've been kind of teeing them up here for Mary when we get to Q&A. So I just appreciate all the engagement. Whatever we can't get to, we will have everybody's name, and we'll be able to follow up with you to make sure you get an answer to some of those questions here today. But just kind of thinking back to that last slide, I love how you presented leveraging student strengths as a strategy. As a former special education teacher, I just know how important it is to help students feel comfortable so they can take risks, and playing to those strengths is just such an important part of that. So I think that was such a great way to frame that scenario. But as we dig into formative assessments more here, we're going to share some other ideas. Mary, would you mind just kind of resetting the table with a high-level summary of how MAP growth data can help us to identify formative assessments, and then I can kind of talk through some scenarios with Otus here first. Oh, I think you might be muted. Yep. There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, you're gonna look to those instructional areas, and the idea here is to really kind of match that to whatever the content is that you're focusing on. So I'm kind of looking ahead to my next unit. I'm going to figure out which instructional area that connects to. I can use that learning continuum again kind of as the map to connect instructional areas to standards, and then from there I'm going to start looking at my specific students who are in probably those lower 2 quintiles, so below the 40th, or again, you might even say the 50th percentile, depending upon if you're using the proficiency studies. And I'm going to take those students and then maybe drill in a little bit to find out where are their strengths and where are their areas for improvement relative to whatever I'm teaching next. So whatever that next content piece is. So I'm just taking a chunk out of it to focus on. And then when I get to my next unit, I'm going to do the same thing again for potentially a different group of students.
That makes sense. So MAP growth provides us that periodic snapshot of student growth. Formative assessments give us that continuous progress monitoring data. So what that tells me and what I'm getting out of this is that we have to use both. It's just that simple. We cannot rely, it's just that simple. We cannot rely solely on MAP growth. We have to give formative assessments to really see what's going on between those testing periods. So the formative assessments can be used to guide your instructional approach in the day-to-day. So formative assessments are going to tell us what your students know, where they're going, how they're going to get there, and then I love this one, how we'll know when they're getting there, because if we don't know when they've reached a certain level of mastery or are ready to move on from a skill, how can we have relevant and meaningful instruction in the classroom? And that's really where technology can come into play, and different tools that feature analytics capabilities or the ability to really drill down into what students know and don't know between those two MAP growth periods is just so important to have as a tool in your toolkit. So I'm going to kind of talk about a scenario here and present some visuals through the lens of Otus to show you what I would do in this scenario. So let's just say that MAP growth identifies reading literature as an area of opportunity for your students. So as a teacher, I'm then going to administer a formative assessment on maybe 2 standards from within the reading literature bundle of, I'm looking at like a 3rd grade standard here, from based on where we're at in our instructional unit. And I'm going to really do that to see which students are struggling with which standard within that particular strand. So in this instance, on my screen here, you can kind of see 2 standards stacked. And you can see that there's a blue end and a red end, right? So I've got visuals that are going to show me how many students are maybe at the level of where they should be with that standard versus how many students are not. So if I'm the teacher in this instance looking at this data right after a formative assessment, because the data is available in real time, I can easily say here now, there's 5 students who need more support on this particular standard here. So that's going to help me hone in on those students for that standard, so that when we give MAP growth at, let's say, the middle of the year, I've been able to, between those periods, isolate a skill and students who need support so that I can eventually move the needle. So when they test again, they are able to meet or be at where you want them to be with that, that particular skill. And this one is just demonstrating understanding of a text. So maybe I'm going to teach that in a small group. Once I find out that these are the students who need support, the next natural questions you're going to have are, okay, well, who are these students? In Otus, you can drill down to find out the names of these students. And then what you can actually do is act on Mary's suggestion of grouping students by level or creating mixed level groups, because you have all of your students, all of their performance levels, and you can see which standards they might be struggling on. You can now create groups. So in this instance, let's just say I want to put those 5 students who need support into the same group. For small group, I want to maybe even be able to track them on other assessments over time as a little group. These are my 5 students who I'm going to work with at a small group table on this particular standard. I can do all of that in Otus. And then maybe the next time I give just those 5 students a formative assessment on this particular skill I retaught to see where they're at. Those other students who have or were already meeting that standard can actually move on. Maybe we're moving on as a class, but I'm working in small group with these students. So these types of insights from formative assessments are just really important to kind of keep at the forefront of what you're doing. And of course, I've done this on paper pencil, I've done this in Google Sheets. There's so many different ways you could administer formatives and use the data. Of course, I want to show you some Otus tools today so that you can kind of envision what it would look like with a tech tool. But before I do that, I just kind of want to dial it back here and think about what your look-fors or must-haves should be if you're evaluating a solution to help you with formative assessments. Thinking about that need to continuously assess students on a variety of skills based on where you're honing in from MAP growth data, it's important that any tool you use supports good teaching and learning. And you might hear me say this again today, but does not contribute further to data silos in your school district. I've worked really with schools across the country who have so many different tools, and in isolation, each of them is fantastic. But when they don't play nicely together or really allow data to be seen in one place, it further contributes to not being able to see a picture of the whole child, which is really why we're here with NWEA today, one of our data partners. When you go into Otus, you can see that NWEA data and actually see your formative assessment data right side by side with that interim progress, maybe summative assessments if you're doing those two, all in one place, which really is helpful. But if you're looking to build any formative assessments or deliver digital assessments, I highly recommend making sure that there is clear alignment between questions and standards so that you can drill down without being able to say, this question is aligned to the standard. It's very difficult to say, okay, all of these students got this question wrong. What do I need to reteach? So that connection is just so important. Of course, a variety of engaging question types helps. Multiple choice over and over again isn't the most fun. And thinking about NWEA and the types of questions students encounter on those MAP growth assessments, sometimes students are highlighting, they have digital tools. It's really nice to be able to replicate that high stakes environment in the interim between those assessments. So I think that's important. Of course, accessibility is at the forefront, just like they have in MAP growth, tools for students who need screen reading technology and so forth. That's all in Otus. Real-time insights. So you give your formative right after. I want to be able to see my data, pull up that little horizontal bar chart that I showed you before like this and say, okay, where are we at? Did we make progress? That is just so important to be able to see in real time, because you need to be spending more time focused on your students and what's next and less time being a statistician kind of going through the scores to figure out what they need. I do have a couple other things on this slide to look for. Of course, auto scoring is helpful, tools for giving meaningful feedback, customizing reports so that you can present, here's how we performed on this particular assessment, here's how we've been performing on VOY, MAP growth, being able to see and generate reports to look at between seasons and kind of comparing the two is critical. So if you'd like to learn more about Otus, I know we included some resources in the resource tab of the library here for you to reference, but putting it all together, you can deliver formative assessments in Otus using ready-to-use assessments. We've got thousands of pre-created standard-aligned assessments available, or you could build your own. We even have AI to help with that if you're into that. You can share anything you build with your team. So maybe I want to build a formative assessment for my class and Mary's class. I know we sat down on our PLC, we identified a couple standards that we want to hone in on. I'm going to assemble an assessment to kind of measure, get a temperature check on where students are at, share that with Mary, and then we're going to come back to our PLC. Or maybe I'm in a bigger district and I'm going to send it to 5 other teachers. Whatever it may be, you can do that. And you can analyze your class or all the classes who took that assessment in Otus as well. I did see some questions around drilling down by subgroups. So maybe looking at how your students performed, how students who have an English language learner status or an IEP performed in comparison to one another. You can definitely do all of that. So that's super important. Before we talk about interventions here and what that might look like, anything, Mary, that you want to add on formative assessments that I missed? I know we're going to talk a little bit about tracking interventions here and then go to Q&A. We're just about down to the final 10 minutes here, but anything you want to add before we transition?
Nope, I think you covered everything beautifully.
All righty. So throughout this webinar, we've really talked about understanding the data, using the data to drive decisions. And Mary touched on some of the different things you can do to figure out what might be an effective next step, or that might even be an intervention for students. So our last question here that we're going to really dig into is, how can you track interventions to ensure that they're effective and really continuously optimized? What can be used to help us do that? And the question that comes to mind for me here is, okay, we made these changes. Is it working? And it becomes very difficult to answer that question if you're not doing all of your analysis of scores in one place, which is why I kind of mentioned, if you're evaluating any tool, not to contribute to a data silo and buy a one-off, or just start using something in your own classroom without working with your team, because it's so important that we all be able to see a child, all of their assessment scores, and then where they're performing across measures in one place. So with Otus, we can definitely help with this. If you are looking to implement MTSS at scale or simply just progress monitor students, the way that this works is you can search across all of your data in Otus. So that might be NWEA MAP, that might be your state assessment, that might be, let's say you're a high school teacher, maybe you're looking across ACT, PSAT assessment data to find students who need support. You can answer questions like, which students qualify for reading intervention? And you can set a threshold using your MAP growth scores to find students who might be below that. Then in your PLCs or as a problem-solving team, you can sit down and say, okay, here's all the students who met that criteria. Who and what support do they need? You can create plans to really map out their path forward. You can set goals that are data-based, such as they'll meet their projected growth, or based on maybe the conditional growth index. Whatever you're using from MAP or elsewhere can be used to track a plan. And then when you pull up any student, you can simply see if they're on track towards that. Okay, let's say they're not on track. What was their score? Where are they at? What do we want to do next? And that's all in one place. So in the same place where you're viewing that MAP growth data, administering your formatives, looking at the data between the two measures, you can map out a path forward and really track progress to see if what you're implementing is moving the needle. Just one more slide I'll put up on the screen here. While we transition to Q&A at Otus, we're always listening to our users and releasing new features. So over the summer, we did a lot of updates to our student plans or progress monitoring plans just to bring some new features in. So things like automatically tracking certain data points in a student's plan. So maybe they've been assessed since the last time you went into their plan, you pull it up and the new data is just in there for you. Some nice automations, indicators that kind of show you at a high level, hey, growth was made since the last time I was in here. Those types of things that really help to make it easier to navigate all the different things that you're doing with data. I just wanted to kind of put this up here while we transition to questions. Mary, I don't know if you had a moment to look through the questions while I was chatting there. I do have a couple here for you. Are you okay if I just kind of fire them at you with our remaining time? All right, let's do it. I really liked this question. Thank you so much, Crystal, for being here with us today and asking this. Crystal is wondering, what's my first step as a new administrator when guiding my teachers who are also new to MAP? Is there a resource that you suggest for Crystal to kind of walk them through the results, or basically get all the information presented in the first 10 minutes? Oh, sorry, Mary, you're muted.
Just by force of habit. But yeah, MAP growth, there's a learning curve to understanding it. So there's a lot that first year to really kind of get under your belt. And so one of the things I would kind of refer back to is going to your kind of partner accounts rep or trainer to sort of get that kind of basic material that really helps teachers understand what MAP growth is. That's why I always start with that on a presentation, so teachers are really grounded on what it does and doesn't show you, because I think that's very important to make sure expectations are set in terms of the level of support it can provide in terms of doing that classroom instruction. So it can take you to a certain level, and then you have to kind of pull out your formative assessment toolkit and some of your other toolkits to kind of work at that. We do have in our, once you become a MAP Growth partner, we do have within the MAP Growth Center, there's the teacher toolkit that you can kind of go through to kind of help teachers get that sense of how the MAP growth data is used, what it all means. The reports can be kind of overwhelming. So I would, really zero in that first year. You're not going to have a lot of growth. You'll have growth over the year, but you're not going to have the historic growth. They're kind of understanding, what does that RIT score represent? How do I put that in the context of national norms, and then also my state specific norms? And that's something a couple of people have had questions, so I'll sort of address this in the same place, is MAP growth tests are aligned to each state standard. So if you're taking a Nevada test versus a Texas test versus Virginia, your instructional areas are going to look different. You're going to get different, instructional area scores. Then your standards are going to look different. We align to those state-specific standards, and then you'll all have your own separate linking study as well. And someone had asked, because Virginia has new standards this year, the standards have just come out; they're just being implemented. It obviously takes us a year or so before we can get that linking data once a new set of standards come out. So you can then, so for those teachers in that first year, getting them to understand kind of what does that RIT mean? A 200 doesn't mean anything in the abstract, but when I add the context of norms, okay, where is that relative to other fifth graders nationally? Now let me see what I'm aiming towards in terms of the projected proficiency that I'm trying to get towards. How far off is a student? What is typical growth? All of that can kind of provide that context for what that score means. And I think that's sort of the best place to start. And as I said, within our, I can see if we can add that to the resources. There's sort of a teacher toolkit of getting started there. And we also have on our NWEA YouTube channel some great, if you really want to kind of the next step to get into understanding RIT 101 and Norms 101, those get a little bit more into the weeds, so that might be kind of the next stage. But I would just really focus on unpacking what is RIT, giving it some context so that random number means something.
That was super helpful, and I appreciate you addressing a couple others that you saw in there in that answer. That was super helpful. I've also seen this one come up a lot in there, and thank you so much. I have at least Maria's name down here as asking this, but there's a couple other folks who've been asking about explaining the difference between growth and achievement. For example, Maria's biggest struggle is having to explain growth in their consistently high achieving students. Any easy way to explain that from an NWEA perspective, or a resource we can point them to?
Sure. Well, and that's another group that I feel like your high achievers and that are showing high growth, that's a group that tends to sort of be ignored, again, on a state summative. We know that these students are going to show proficiency. So I know that, but here I can get a sense, am I really stretching them to the limits of their growth? If they're up in that, I saw some people talking about 95th, 99th percentile, then I know that I'm really pushing those students, as opposed to the kids who are showing high achievement, but their growth is at the 20th percentile. Those are students I know I'm not possibly challenging enough, or I'm not engaging them enough in some way. And I don't know if those questions are kind of hinting at is there something different I should be doing in terms of those students who are at that high growth and high achievement. We'll never say that at this score, this means you have to change this student's program, or definitely put them in gifted and talented, or accelerate them. That's something that has to be done on a district by district basis. Although we do give some guidance around things like gifted and talented. I didn't put that resource in the list, but I can look that up and have that sent out. But again, doesn't give you a hard cut score or number, but just gives you some things to consider if you want to use map growth as one point of data to kind of help screen students for, again, some type of enrichment or acceleration. But it's going to vary based on the student, what the district has in terms of offering. So no easy answer there, unfortunately. I can't tell you at this number, do this, but that certainly would be, you could set up map growth as kind of you could set an internal district score of, if a student is really achieving at this level and their growth is at this level, we want to dig in deeper and consider what more we can be doing for that student.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the response there. We'll do one more question and then we are going to wrap it up. The engagement today has just been absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much. I am still seeing some questions around those high performing students, but I want to transition to a question from Jennifer here because I think this is kind of a nice wrap up. Jennifer is wondering, oops, she just bounced here. Sorry, somebody else asked a question to go jumped a little bit. Okay, I found it again. Thank you for bearing with me. How do you recommend helping teachers to support students in developing action plans around their goals? I know when I was a teacher, we would create SMART goals using map growth data. So Jennifer's kind of looking for some guidance on helping students to be involved in that growth setting goal setting, not growth setting. Well, I guess kind of the same, but how do we involve students in that so that they kind of take some ownership over how they're growing and their scores as they, reach an age level where that's appropriate?
Yeah, well, you can certainly talk about the sort of at a high level, the idea of like, well, this is how much a student typically grows, but I really think that, you can grow even more than that. You can kind of talk in that language. I try to avoid too much of, we want you to grow 6 RIT points, because that doesn't necessarily mean anything to a student. So while the RIT is helping you kind of get a sense of where you're trying to stretch students, what I would do with the student is focus on, having conversations with them around, what are their areas where they feel like, oh, this is something I find difficult or I want to work on. And you obviously correlating that with your map growth and your formative data to kind of see where that is, but engage them with doing some self-evaluation of what their areas of opportunity are. And then taking a look at, okay, what are the things we can do in there to help with that? So I'm not positioning it as, I want you to get a higher RIT score, because that doesn't mean anything. We can talk about, oh, you're having a little bit of trouble. You're telling me that you're finding it hard to read informational text, or you're struggling when we read these type of literature. What are the things we want to work on? That's where what you know about teaching and what you know about your students comes into play in terms of, all right, we're going to really work on these specific things. That's hopefully going to drive that growth, but you're putting in the context of what's happening in the classroom and the actual strategies you're going to use with students, as opposed to making it all about the data. Because again, that data, especially when you're talking about elementary students, might not always have a lot of meaning or context. And there are plenty of schools that do celebrations and things around getting, above typical growth and things like that. And some of those are wonderful. But when you're talking with a student, I'd want to personalize it to what you're doing in class, what they're observing about themselves, what you're observing. And then kind of the map growth becomes the demonstration of that growth, as opposed to kind of the driver of it. What you're doing every day with your students is the driver of it.
That was a great sentiment to wrap up on there. Thank you so much, Mary, for being here with us, being our map growth expert. I know I learned more about map growth than I ever learned about it in my tenure as a teacher using the tool. So I hope this was informative for others as it was for me. As mentioned, you can download all of the resources from the council here, and this is recorded. So spread the word about all the different ways you can use map growth data to support your students. If you'd like to get in touch with us at Otus, we'd love to talk about how you can visualize your map growth data, deliver formative assessments, and create plans to better support students' needs as they go forward. We are otus.com. And if you'd like to ask any questions of NWEA, we've got their website here as well, nwea.org. But Mary, you are just so informative. So thank you so much. And we wish everyone a great day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.